Okay, I apologize for the stories. It's just that I couldn't figure out how to use those, Microsoft thingies for the. So I left a few drawings, and I just want to talk about specifically, if you watch the news or you read the papers, or if you listen to both the government and the so-called opposition, you hear them going on and on about the danger of the budget deficit or the deficit to GDP ratio and how dangerous it is to the capitalist system. However, you also might have noticed that while the government has introduced budget cuts, which are then justified by the dangerous budget deficit, you may be noticing that the deficit is not shrinking, it's actually rising. Okay? You probably have also noticed that the economy is stagnant, that when they're talking about 0.1 to 0.2% so-called economic growth, that's economic stagnation. Okay? So, clearly the benefit cuts are not cutting the deficit, and the economy is not growing. So we need to ask what is really going on, and what is the government up to, and what are austerity measures actually trying to do, rather than what they're saying they're trying to do. Okay? So, to answer that question, it's important to define what is actually meant by austerity. Now, first of all, if you look at that first graph there, you can see that austerity is not something that's shared equally by all classes. As you can see, the people primarily being hit by it are the poorest, those primarily dependent on benefits, and then the working poor. As you can see, there's your middle classes. This is a breakdown by income deciles. And this is irrespective of the insistence of various governments that are either voluntarily introducing it, like Britain, or being forced to introduce it by the Troika of the EU, the ECB, and the IMF, like in Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Ireland. So, now essentially the burden of austerity is being borne by the poor and the working class. Moreover, it is primarily being borne by women and the disabled in the UK. Now, I'm going to talk primarily about women more in this paper and leave a much more fulfilling discussion for Roger to deal with people, address the issue of people with disability, because very rarely do people talk about women. Now, the reason why it's primarily being borne by women is that they are disproportionately employed in the public sector. Now, according to Unison, 65% of public sector workers are women, and almost a quarter of working women are in the public sector jobs in Britain. This is the case in general throughout Europe. Okay, so it's not only in Britain that women are being hammered. Now, additionally, women are more dependent upon the social welfare state. We're more heavily employed as part-time and temporary labor, both voluntary and forced, and this is primarily due to care or responsibility. And that means, essentially, a far lower income than someone who's doing a full-time job. So this means that women are more dependent on benefits to cover living expenses. Lone parent households are predominantly female, and they're feeling the impact of the cuts far harder. 1/5 of women's income is made up of welfare payments and tax credits, as compared to 1/10 for men. Okay? If you want to put it another way, benefits make up twice as much of women's income than men's. 74%, by 2011, 74% of budget cuts are being taken from women's incomes. So, what is austerity doing? The introduction of austerity is part of a long-term attempt to recover profitability in the advanced capitalist world. Okay, and this is specifically outside of the financial sector. Now, various governments and the Troika are using the crisis as a cover or a justification for increasing income and wealth inequality, and believing or justifying this on that this will enable economic growth. In other words, they're trapped in the supply side of monetarist economic policy. Now, this is evident if you look at how the policies have been introduced, that it is primarily usage of monetary policy, for example, quantitative easing, and tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. And these form the sole basis of stimulation for the economy during this crisis. Now, austerity is being introduced for two reasons. Given low profitability and resulting stagnation, the economic crisis is being used to squeeze wage incomes to keep profits high. And that's specifically, as I said, outside of the financial sector, which we know has recovered from the crisis. As I said, this is part of a long-term attempt to undermine workers' incomes and working conditions in the advanced capitalist world, And this is in the face of continuing problems of profitability. All right, and those continuing problems of profitability, specifically in industry and manufacturing, which is what shifted, which led to the shift to emerging and peripheral capitalist economies. Now, in the long term, privatization of what is privatization of what is considered to be the potentially profitable sectors of the public sector is being introduced. Now, this is not only being done to open up new areas of profitability. Okay, it's being done essentially to undermine the unions in the public sector and the wages and working conditions, because the public sector is the last bastion of unionization in the advanced capitalist world. Okay, now they keep on going on and on about clear evidence of pay gaps and pension provision between public and private sector workers, and that is true, and that is clearest for women workers. Now, while this is then being constantly argued by the Troika and right-wing governments that public sector workers have it better than those in the private sector, and hence that public sector workers need to have benefits reduced, all this basically is good old-fashioned divide and rule. We know what the game is, okay? We need to play men off against women, play private sector workers off against the public sector workers, play white people against people of color, okay? Now, essentially what this is a race to the bottom that's being justified on the ideology of competition, where essentially they know they can't, the advanced capitalist world cannot compete or survive on wages earned by those in the emerging capitalist economy or in the periphery. So, we know that corporations and the government can never lower wages enough in the advanced capitalist world to be able to compete as low-skilled labor with China and India. And that's certainly that is also the case. I mean, forget Bangladesh, because there's no way that we can survive in these countries. All right? Now, if you look at a study of countries in the Euro area, public sector wages are higher compared to private sector pay, and that's the case especially for women in both supervisory and non-supervisory roles. And it's especially the case for women in lower paid work. This holds in all countries that were examined in the report, and this is especially the case in Portugal, Ireland, Greece, and Spain. Now, we know what the basis of the wage and benefit gap between public and private sector workers is, and that derives from the weakness of unions in the private sector, specifically in areas where employment opportunities exist. All right, and for women, it actually relates to the fact that they're trapped in low-paying service sector work in the private sector, like retail and sales. Even commensurate employments in public and private sector, for example, if people are actually working as cleaners, wages and job protections are actually lower due to the lack of union protections. So, privatization, again, is an attempt to undermine workers' standards of living through destruction of the trade union power in the public sector. Now, in case it's not obvious, because it should be obvious if you listen just to what they're saying, the arguments that are supporting lower wages and privatization are ideologically based. They're not based upon any historic policies that have previously worked in the past to deal with any economic crisis. Okay? The shrinking of wage incomes over time, and that's going to be, you can see that here on this graph. The second one, we can see the shrinking of wage incomes over time, and this has been happening essentially in the advanced capitalist world since the late 1970s. It initially started with the destruction of industrial and manufacturing, and what also then happened is that it became, they consistently started decreasing, especially, for example, in the States. Benefits, and also there was wages basically were being eroded. So what has happened then is, in the absence of access to easy but rather expensive credit, which led to the bubble burst, okay, or a universal social welfare state which maintains incomes, this means that what happens is that we have an increased possibility of realization crises. What I mean by that is basically that while basically people can actually, there's more than enough potential profitability, it's the question of these goods actually being sold and these services actually being sold. And I would basically argue that this is the major part of the current stagnation that we've seen in the advanced capitalist world that we're seeing today. Because in the absence of consumption, profits remain unrealizable. And there's absolutely no reason for the private sector to increase employment, production, and investment. All right? So we want to add to this the shift away from full-time work with benefits and decent working conditions towards increase part-time and temporary and subcontractor work. These forms of labor, some are often not unionized. They also have lower wages, sometimes due to unskilled nature. Now, we're seeing rising levels of underemployment, and we can see this quite clearly from the period of April to June 2000 to 2012. You can see the rate of underemployment, part-timism, and forced part-timism very clearly on the chart. Okay? Now, what happens when you have lower incomes? It means that things that people might have gotten for free at the point of contact with the social welfare state won't necessarily be demanded when people have to pay for them. They just won't take them. Okay? So that means that this whole point of privatization, that these things themselves may not be as profitable as anticipated. So if you need to pay for healthcare, like what's happening, which is more relevant to Greece, what happens is that you're going to start rationing that healthcare. You're not going to be, you're not going to buy it. If you have to pay for childcare fully, you're basically not going to take it. You're going to take it, you're basically going to have to either reduce your work hours or you're going to have to become unemployed. Okay? Now, the additional, most obvious thing is that privatization means that these services are now subject to a profit criteria under capitalism. And that's most assuredly going to affect access to services in terms of supply for the working class and the poor, because they know that people are not going to buy it, so they're not going to have it available. Okay? Simple enough. So, all this argument about so-called, everything will be more competitive, if we privatize it, blah, blah. I mean, this actually becomes rather laughable, because when something becomes privatized and inevitably monopolized, because this is going to be due to the nature of provisions and the demands for the system. All right? Now, I'm saying these arguments are ideological, and the reason I'm saying that is that we need to understand that economic theory and policy derives from the social science, and it has a strong political component, and it reflects the political positions of those that make economic theory and propose economic policy. All right? So mainstream economics has always functioned to serve the interests of the capitalist system, whether it's of the Keynesian, monetarist, or even Austrian bent. Okay? Its policy differences reflect the different political strands of those empowering the system and those who are running the system. Okay? So, whether to choose to increase deficit spending in a crisis or to cut it is a political choice. The same holds for maintaining decent wages and standards of living versus increasing income and wealth differentials. Those are political choices. A very important political choice that's relevant in the UK is having a national health system versus having private health care. These are political choices. All right? And their economic theoretical justifications are merely legitimations for policies. Okay? These are not indisputable truths, irrespective of what you hear on the news all the time. Okay? Now, there is no demonstrable historical use of some of the policies that we're seeing where they've been successful and they've worked. We know that Keynesian policies have worked in the past to ameliorate booms and busts. And we also know that unregulated financial industrial capitalism leads to increasing crises. We know that. Okay? So we have a financial recovery for the financial, we have a recovery for the financial sector, but these are jobless recoveries. So, quickly, we need to address the argument that the government deficit and debt is at a level which is problematic and requires cuts. The idea that you can ensure economic growth in the short term while cutting the government deficit, it's not based upon any historical understanding of economic history. Okay? And this is not what the British government is doing. In effect, they're increasing the deficit due to tax decreases for corporations and the wealthy, while lowering incomes for the working class and the poor. The decreased corporate tax rate is part of this beggar thy neighbor strategy that was so very successful in Ireland, all right, in an attempt to lure capital investment from other countries. So the impact of this is we're seeing widening income and wealth inequality, quantitative easing, which is increasing the money supply while buying bad debt from the banks and the corporations. It's not going to increase investment, which enables economic growth. Money is being funneled for short-term speculative investment in the financial markets. Bank lending is down for several reasons, but it's primarily due to the perception of insufficient profitability on the part of businesses to warrant increased production. What that means, in the context of the capitalist system, is the only basis for growth is for government investment in job creation. And that's the opposite policies that are being conducted in countries that are undergoing austerity, where the public sector, the social welfare state, is being squeezed both in terms of employment and also net income is being squeezed. In a capitalist economic crisis, essentially, the last thing that should be done is to decrease the government deficit if you want to ensure the economy returns to economic growth. Okay? Okay. I just want to say one thing. Keynesian policies don't work in the context of a larger, shall we say, an internationalized capitalist movement or under globalization. Okay? They're more effective when production and consumption are done in the same country. And then government investment can be easily targeted to strengthen the effects. All right? So they're not going to work. So the problem is you can call for increasing amounts of Keynesian solutions, but no one, and that includes every single bourgeois or mainstream economist, has no idea of how successful Keynesian solutions will be. All right? So we're going to need more than Keynesian solutions as their sole purpose is only to ameliorate the inevitable crisis of the system. We need policies in which people's needs take precedence over profits. Okay? If I have 2 seconds? Okay. I just want to talk about the importance of growth. Why did they go on and on about economic growth? Why is it so important? Okay? And if you think about it this way, if you take a given level of wage income, if you're going to ensure continuous profitability, the system requires growth. In the absence of growth, and with wages fixed by contract and social conditions, profits stagnate and start to fall. Okay? Now, to keep the system moving in a period of falling profitability, essentially, you need to undermine wages, and that's what we're seeing since the late 1970s. Now, the purpose of this is to keep profits up, and that's also what underlies the international movement of manufacturing and industrial sectors. Internationalization of the capital system. Its purpose is to ensure lowering of costs of raw materials, machinery, and wage costs. And China's export-led growth is based on the fact that the goods could be sold in the advanced capitalist world. Well, what happens if you undercut the incomes in the advanced capitalist world? Okay, that's a serious question, because if you undercut the incomes of people, then who's going to buy the goods produced by China? And this is why everybody is talking about, oh, we need to increase the incomes in China. And if we increase the incomes in China, well, what happens to us over here? Okay? We need to know what was going to happen to the people in the advanced capitalist world. Will we be reduced to a backwater and only providing financial services, which I think will the capitalist system, because it's not us? Will it be reduced to a backwater providing only financial services to human areas? What happens to the majority of people living in the system? Okay? What happens to us if we become redundant to the needs of a system that's based upon profitability and not human needs? And this is the essential question that we need to ask now. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, who's great on? There will be time for questions at the end, so please hold those if you have them. Second speaker is Jim Bailey.